Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we journey into the shadowed halls of myth to witness the tale of Perseus and Medusa, a story of bravery, divine aid, and a monster whose gaze could turn mortals to stone. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you, as a fellow knight of these tales, to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share what legends or myths you would have us explore next. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. A chest on the open sea. The chest rode the swell in a slow rhythm as Dana held the child close and measured the distance between her steady breaths. Perseus slept in brief spells, and Danae counted each rise and fall, letting the simple work of watching shape the next moment. The wood creaked under the push of the water, and the sound kept Danae alert to the fact that the world still carried them onward. She thought of Argos and the gate she had passed for the last time, and she steadied herself against what could not be changed. Perseus had spoken as a king, and the words were iron in their simplicity, leaving no room for pleading or reconsidering. Danae cradled Perseus and repeated to herself that survival could be small and plain, like a name held carefully against the day. Perseus, though tiny, filled the chest with meaning, and the thought gave Danae a steady course that no shoreline could yet provide. She kept one hand on the lid as if confirming the boundaries of their world, and she counted again before setting her mind to rest. Perseus dreamed in whatever way infants do, and Danae leaned into patience, preferring quiet decisions to large hopes that could quickly turn. When the swell rose again, Danae considered the path that had led to the sea, and she measured it in small, manageable thoughts. In Argos, earlier in that same season, King Perseus walked the length of his halls and counted his years alongside his choices. The cool shade of stone steadied his steps, and the place granted him room to examine the stubborn line of fear he carried. Perseus had heard the oracle at Delphi say that a daughter would bear a son who would one day end his life. The words settled into him with a weight that governed meals, decisions, and how he counted the loyalty of those around him. Danae remained his only child, and Perseus looked at her with a father's care complicated by the hard edge of a ruler's duty. When no sons were born to Perseus, the prophecy tightened around his judgment, and he considered stronger ways to direct what seemed inevitable. He ordered a chamber made to keep Dana apart from the world, and he pictured safety as something that could be constructed and sealed. Dana complied with the command because disobedience offered no path, and she held herself still within the limits her father had created. Perseus visited the chamber and told himself the danger would pass with time, and he framed each day as a practical step toward safety. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later, because a chamber did not change desire, nor did walls guide fate. Inside the chamber, Danae lived in measured routines, and she taught herself to treat each hour as a simple task to be completed. Danae was watched by servants who answered to Perseus, and she met each pair of eyes with calm, though she felt the heavy shape of restriction. In that closed place, the gods were spoken of as distant, yet Zeus noticed Danae, and something crossed the boundary that Perseus believed secure. Zeus came to Danae as a golden rain, and the event entered the chamber without open doors, settling where human intentions had set a guard. Danae understood that life would follow, and she carried the knowledge with the same steady discipline she used for each part of her day. Perseus was born within the chamber, and Danae held the infant with a care that belonged to her alone, however many oaths the guards had sworn. Perseus heard the news, and the words gathered all his fears into one point where choice would have to be set in motion. The king looked at Danae and the infant, and he weighed blood against safety. Telling himself that harsh measures could stand as proper governance, he resolved not to stain his hands with open violence, and he chose instead a careful distance that would remove responsibility while preserving control. Dana watched his resolve take shape in practical arrangements, and she said her son's name to herself as a way to keep courage plain. First, Perseus called for carpenters, and he directed them to shape a chest broad enough for a woman and a child to sit. Then, at his order, they sealed the seams and asked for pitch, and workmen brought what was needed with expressions that revealed nothing of their minds. The sharp smell of pitch rose as they brushed it along the joins, and Perseus looked away as if distance could purify the purpose he served. He ordered food and water set within the chest, and he told himself this provision made the act a form of mercy rather than sentence. Now here is what came next. Since we keep the pace steady here, and the steps mattered as much as the fear behind them, guards carried Dana and Perseus from the chamber, and they set the two within the chest while Perseus watched for any sign of resistance. Dana looked at Perseus and did not argue, and Perseus held her gaze briefly, knowing the terms were fixed by something larger than either of them. The chest was carried to the shore, and men waited for the right swell, setting their hands carefully beneath the weight without meeting Dana's eyes. Perseus gave a signal, and the chest slid forward, and the sea received it with emotion that made every thought feel smaller than duty. He turned from the water and walked back toward Argos, while Dana steadied Perseus, and the space between them widened in a way that could not close. So Acrisius chose fear, and Dana and Perseus went to sea in a chest that carried both risk and the plain tools for survival. The days stretched without markers, and Dana measured time by how often Perseus ate and how many pauses she could secure between his needs. When the chest rose and dipped, she spread her stance and adjusted her balance, turning motion into something almost orderly by refusing to be hurried. Perseus stirred at times, and Dana held him closer, setting his small life as the fixed point by which every other choice would be judged. The cold spray touched her face when the swell rose higher, and Dana blinked and drew the child closer, returning to her steady rhythm of care. She formed Perseus' name in her thoughts to anchor herself, and she shaped her plans into small steps that could be carried out. Nights, if that is what they were, passed into days, and Danae kept attention fixed on water, food, and the rest of the child. Perseus endured each shift of the sea as infants do, and Dana took his long spells as signs that she was meeting the simple demands before her. She thought of Acrisius less with anger than with clarity, and she understood that his fear had already taken him farther than he intended. The sea would carry Dano and Perseus where it would, and that road, if we can call it that, leaned toward an island and a fisherman named Dictys. Out on the open water, the chest kept Dano and Perseus together, and that togetherness gave shape to a future neither of them could name. Danae chose patience with each small action, and Perseus slept and stirred in turns, growing according to a measure untroubled by courts and declarations. The quiet lap of water against wood marked time in its own way, and Danae found herself less afraid of waiting than of forgetting care. Acrisius remained behind in Argos, and the choice he made stood as a fixed stone in his life, however he measured its rightness. Zeus had passed through Danae's life with the ease of a god, and Perseus, who knew nothing of thrones, became the steady center of her days. The sea bore the chest, and the chest bore the two of them, and in that simple exchange the path of a story settled. Perseus would later carry names and tasks larger than anyone planned, but he began as an infant held by Dana, who preferred doing to speaking. She kept his future nearby, keeping the present orderly, and she accepted that safety could be built from food, water, and the refusal to despair. Medusa was nowhere near their thoughts, and yet the chest moved in the same world where that name would one day matter to Perseus. For now, the mother steadied the child, and the world held them up, and the long path began without public ceremony beyond their courage. Chapter 2. Nets and Quiet Shores. Morning on Seriphos found Perseus hauling a heavy net beside Dictys, while Dana watched from the shore and kept a quiet count. Dictys worked slow and sure, and he set the rhythm as if the sea itself had taught him where to place each pull. Perseus looked to Dictys for timing, but Perseus also glanced back at Danae, because her safety filled his thoughts more than fish. Danae stood close to the waterline and kept her cloak drawn, and Danae measured days by his growth and by the nets they shared. Dictys saw the boy's careful eye, and he nodded when he caught that look, because patience pleased the fisherman more than quick strength. Perseus strained against the line, then let the rope ease as Dictys signaled, and the two of them kept the boat steady together. Salt stung Perseus' hands, and it reminded Perseus that the sea gave work first, and only later gave anything like comfort. Danae called out a number for the baskets, and she praised Dictys with words that showed how gratitude sat plain in her manner. Dictys answered with a small wave and returned to the knots, and Dictys kept the boy near him whenever the shore drew curious eyes. Perseus learned early that kindness could be firm, and he learned it from Dictys, while Dana held that lesson together with steady quiet. In those years, Seriphos moved at the pace of tide and trade, and the villagers knew each other's habits like family. Perseus walked along the same paths to the harbour, and Perseus greeted the same mothers, children and old men who watched the boats. Danae kept their home neat and light, and Danae stitched useful things with a calm hand that steadied the room when worries rose. Dictys returned at dusk with lines to mend, and he invited Perseus to sit and work through snarls that needed patient fingers. The cry of gulls carried across the masts each afternoon, and it gave a simple signal that the boats had started homeward. Polydectes ruled the island from a hall above the quay, and he sent word rather than walking often among the fishing sheds. Dictys kept a measured distance from that hall, while Dictys still paid what was due and spoke plainly when courtiers came around. Perseus watched how a modest life protected quiet, and Perseus began to stand a half step in front of his mother without thinking. Danae noticed the way he placed himself that way, and she accepted it, though she guarded against pride rooting itself in the boy. It may not have seemed like much then, but it mattered later, because those small habits hardened into choices when pressure finally arrived. Dictys had earned his years at sea, and Dictys spoke in short phrases that left room for thought to settle before the next word. Dana carried herself with a quiet dignity, and Dana never leaned on favors, which made her stand out in a place built on barter. Perseus grew tall faster than anyone expected, and Perseus lifted loads without showing off because praise from Dictys meant more than talk from others. Dictys taught him knots and seasons, and he added the pieces that shaped a man, like keeping promises and leaving anger to cool. Polydectes, the king, had a smooth manner, and Polydectes smiled easily, yet his eyes always searched for what was useful to him. Perseus noticed that search, and Perseus also noticed how Polydectes looked at Danae as if her quiet would bend under royal patience. Danae answered the king with care and distance, and Danae kept her words limited to courtesy that gave no space for misunderstanding. Daintes stood near whenever the king came down to the harbour, and Daintes made plain he would not let the house be troubled. Polydaintes wore a cloak dyed deeper than most, and that single mark of richness made him a presence even before he spoke. Perseus stored these details like net weights, and he used them later, though at the time it simply felt like watching out for family. First came small gifts from Polydectes to Dana, and Polydectes sent olive oil, a garment, and a promise that he would always protect her. Dana returned the gifts with thanks that were true but firm, and Dana explained that her household owed its peace to staying untouched by favor. Perseus heard of these gifts last, and Perseus learned it from Dictys, because Dictys believed clear talk would keep the house safe. Then came visits from courtiers who hinted at duties, and they suggested that young men should prove themselves before a generous ruler. Dictys paid the added levies and kept the tone level, while Dictys sent Perseus to deliver fish so the boy could hear the talk. Polydectes began holding feasts more often, and Polydectes liked to hear men promise horses, tribute, and marvels he said brightened the name of Seriphos. The clink of bronze cups travelled down from the hall at night, and it told the harbour who sat inside and who did not. Sailors told stories on the pier to fill the waiting, and they named far coasts, strange beasts, and a trio of sisters people called Gorgons. Perseus listened with care and weighed every word, and Perseus noticed when Polydectes' men repeated certain names with the polish of plan. We keep the pace steady here because that is how it unfolded, with small pressures laid down like stones leading toward a chosen place. By then, Perseus had learned nets beside Dictys while Polydectes pressed Danae, and that simple pattern shaped the work and the worry of each day. Polydectes pressed harder without raising his voice, and Polydectes framed his wish as duty, which made refusal sound like a fault that weighed on everyone. Danae kept her ground with the same exact words, and Danae relied on that steadiness as if it were another wall against the weather. Dictys measured the risk and told the boy to be steady, and he promised Percy he would stand where a father ought to stand. Percy felt that promise land heavy, and Percy also felt a tug to do something more direct, because youth often pulled like that on strong shoulders. The name Medusa reached his hearing piece by piece, and it came in tavern talk, in courtly boasts, and in the easy cruelty of rumours. Polydectes' men made sport of the name, and they suggested that only a real protector would go far enough to silence such a monster. The evening breeze cooled Perseus' neck as he walked home, and it slowed his steps long enough for him to settle the worry into resolve. Perseus did not speak big words yet, but Perseus set his mind on shielding Danae, even if that meant meeting talk with a dangerous promise. The next part arrived at a feast, and the boast he would make there drew itself from these days like a line from a coil. Looking back from later years, Seriphos gave Perseus the shape he kept, and the shape came from patience more than from daring. Dictys had offered a model of care without fuss, and Dictys taught that steady work could hold a family safer than a guard of spears. Danae gave him purpose by simply staying near, and Danae showed how a person could meet pressure without letting bitterness take root. Polydectes, for all his power, had unknowingly pressed Percy into that purpose, and Polydectes turned a boy's attention into a man's vigilance. Perseus took those lessons into his bones, and Perseus began to think of his life as something set toward keeping danger from their door. The name Medusa had not yet become a burden, and it was only a word that hung in the air with the other stories. Dictys trimmed a rope in the evening, and Dictys nodded to Danae when the day's troubles had been laid aside for sleep. Warm lamplight pooled on the table between them, and it made a small island of calm that let their talk taper into ease. Perseus rested his hands there and counted the steps he would take, and Perseus knew those steps began with respect and ended with duty. That was how the quiet shore prepared him, and the calm before the feast gave him enough balance to hold himself steady when the test came. Chapter 3. A boast at the king's table. Around the tables people leaned in and spoke while Polydectes watched from his seat, and Perseus kept close to Danae with Dictys nearby. The king had called for a gathering that seemed light-hearted on the surface, yet the young man read a purpose behind the smiles. Polydectes let the talk flow, and he let the wine go around, but his gaze returned to Perseus as steady as a mark. Perseus knew the weight of attention, and he kept his head high, because Danae sat near him and relied on his steadiness. Dictys watched as well, careful with his words because he had seen Polydectes turn a pleasant mood into something useful for his wishes before. Danae kept her gaze low and her hands folded, and she waited through the speeches without adding much, since bluntness never served her on that island. When the servants carried in more platters, Perseus straightened a little, because he expected some new demand to follow generosity, as it often did from rulers. Polydectes lifted his hand and waited, and the room quieted in the easy way that told Perseus people had learned to listen when the king paused. Perseus met that pause without flinching, because he knew Polydectes liked to set a stage and then draw a single person forward. Oil lamps sent a steady yellow across the tables and shoulders, and in that tame light, the king began the talk that would shape the night. It was late in the season on Seriphos, with fewer boats going out each morning, and the hall took people in as the days shortened. Polydectes had spread word that he would take a wife from another island, and he spoke of celebrations and gifts that would honor the match. He named horses as the proper sign from the men of Seriphos, because the bride's family was known for racing, or so he said that night. Perseus understood why that choice pinched, since fishermen did not keep fine horses, while princes and landowners could claim them as easily as old clothes. Danae saw the shape of it too, and she kept still beside her son, because any complaint would have seemed like an excuse to certain listeners. Dictys had warned Perseus that Polydectes liked plans that squeezed a person without raising open anger, and this gathering fit that pattern neatly. Around the edges stood men from the farms, men from the harbour, and a few visiting traders who smiled readily when the king glanced their way. Polydectes liked a crowd when he presented his plans, because people in a group agreed more easily, and dissent slipped away once the first praise began. The smell of roasted fish rose from the side tables, and it drifted across the benches while servants refilled pitchers and kept faces pleasant. It may not have seemed like much then, yet the arrangement of faces and seats mattered later in small practical ways. Perseus measured those small signs, then looked toward Danae again, and he held his place as Polydectes stood and called for gifts and pledges. Polydectes was a man who smiled easily, with practiced gestures, and many took comfort from that surface. He liked to leave the impression that he asked for little, though his requests came often, and the sum of them weighed heavily on the island. Perseus, for his part, was broad in the shoulders from work, and he spoke plainly, with the quick pride of a youth who protected his home. Danae gave counsel with few words and steady eyes, because silence guarded her better than any claim, and people respected the dignity she carried each day. Dictys stood at the edge of these gatherings when he had to attend, and he protected people best by noticing trouble early and giving space to breathe. Around Polydectes sat men who liked nearness to power, and they nodded at every turn, because the nods brought small favors that made their days easier. Some of those men had their own farms, some captained boats, and some simply waited for a chance to be noticed and named to small posts. Perseus saw how the king used them, and he kept his distance, because favors that came too quickly often required repayment that did not stop. That distance pleased Danae, and it pleased Dictys as well, because trouble had a way of finding proud men who stood too near a restless ruler. A gold pin at Polydectes' shoulder caught the lamplight when he turned toward Perseus, and the bright flash marked the moment when the talk narrowed. First, Polydectes described the bride and the honor due her family, and he praised the old customs that placed rich gifts in a leader's hands. Then he asked each man of rank to declare what he would offer, and the names circled the room with easy promises of fine horses. Perseus listened as men who seldom owned a saddle pledged animals they would borrow from cousins, and he saw how eager agreement covered a quieter truth. When the turn came to Perseus, he rose and spoke his name, because the order of pledges required he answer like the others in that hall. He said he had no horse to give, since he had not the stables for it, and he waited through the pause that always follows plain truths. Polydectes smiled and asked what gift could equal a horse, and he leaned forward just enough to press the weight of the room upon the answer. Perseus answered quickly that if a horse would please the king, then a greater thing would please him more, and he named Medusa's head. He spoke the name because danger named plainly sometimes stilled a bully, and he trusted that boldness might keep Danae away from further pressure in that hall. The scrape of a chair across the floor marked how the room shifted, and Polydectes lifted his hand as if to bless the pledge he had trapped. He declared that Perseus had shown honor beyond the rest, and he named a time by which the head should be delivered, while the guests nodded in relief. We keep the pace steady here, because it helps to see how each small turn in that room shaped what Perseus did next. After the feast ended, Perseus walked outside with Danae and Dictys, and the three of them stood together near the edge of the square. Danae took his arm and urged him to weigh the risk, since words spoken in a crowded room did not always need to be carried out at once. Perseus said that Polydectes would press her harder if he stepped back now, and he would not let that happen while he had strength. Dectes advised caution and a clear plan, and he promised to keep Dana safe while Perseus travelled, because the island had more kind eyes than cruel hands. At the feast, Perseus had spoken, and Polydectes had bound him to the words, which meant the road ahead reached beyond oars and familiar shores. Danae said the gods watched those who acted for the sake of their mothers, and she asked only that he return to her without needless pride in the way. Perseus agreed to keep his steps measured, and he promised to listen to signs from strangers who might know more than island men about far coasts and hidden dangers. Polydectes sent messengers in the morning to repeat the terms, and he smiled when people heard how Perseus had pledged more than any man present that night. The smell of the sea drifted along the street as Perseus gathered simple gear, and the salt reminded him of other crossings he had survived as a child. He looked once more toward Danae and Dictys and said he would return, and he carried that promise with the same care as any blade or rope. In those hours after the boast, Perseus understood that words could bind as tightly as rope, and he accepted the tie because it shielded Danae. Polydectes had not forced him with a blade, yet the path seemed no less firm beneath his feet, and he stepped onto it without complaint. He could have argued for time or for a different gift, but he knew Polydectes would twist delay into more pressure for his mother. Danae watched him prepare in silence, and she set aside the few things he would need, because practical care served better than worry in those moments. Dictys said he would keep his door open for her, and he meant it, since his steadiness had already carried them through other small storms on Seriphos. Perseus slept little that night and rose early, because rest was hard when a promise shaped the day ahead, and old stories stirred in the mind. The embers in the hearth gave a soft red under the ashes, and that small glow matched the steady way he carried his purpose into morning. It may not have seemed like much then, yet the decision to act without swagger set the measure for how Perseus would face the danger ahead. He did not chase glory with that boast, because he had spoken to guard Danae, and that reason steadied every step he took afterward. By morning, the island carried on with its work while his path bent toward places he had only known by name, and he moved quietly toward them. Chapter 4. What the nymphs kept safe. He set out before the sun had lifted high, following a stony path that wound away from the island, carrying his promise as a quiet weight. Perseus kept his thoughts plain and steady, because tangled thinking tripped the feet, and steadiness was all he could afford. The cool morning air touched his cheeks, and that small freshness reminded him that he was still only a man who had spoken boldly. He walked until the path thinned, and the hills leaned closer, and then a taller figure waited ahead with the kind of patience that calmed him. Athena stood there with a helm set just so, and she looked at Perseus the way a teacher looked at a pupil who would listen. He bowed without fuss, and he kept his eyes on her face, because Athena disliked show and favoured attention that did its work. Hermes came next with quick feet and a half smile, and he carried ease the way other men carried burdens, light and practiced. Perseus felt the ground of the day shift in a helpful way, and he let their presence turn his bold promise into a guided plan. Athena spoke first and spoke plainly, telling Perseus that the path to Medusa curved through others who watched over old things. He listened, and he agreed to follow, and the three of them set their steps toward places most people avoided without being told. In those days the road to the Graeae ran along a narrow stretch of coast, where hills pressed hard, and the sea pressed harder beside them. Perseus travelled with Athena and Hermes at an easy pace, because hurrying into the unknown usually meant missing what mattered along the edges. The smell of damp stone gathered as they reached a shallow cave, and the place kept its own manner even when the day was fair. The Graeae lived in that dim place, three sisters who kept the oldest watch and shared what little sight they had between them. Perseus waited at the mouth while Hermes stepped closer, and Athena stayed by his shoulder, lending steadiness that made waiting feel like doing. The sisters murmured in turns, and their talk sounded like memory trying to remember itself, slow and careful and sure of its own age. Perseus knew his task depended on their habit, and he held himself quiet, because the quiet told them he could be trusted to listen. Athena told him in a low voice that timing would matter more than force, and Hermes nodded as if to say he would show the moment. The place did not threaten Perseus, though it was old and strange, and he let that small truth keep his hands from tightening around nothing. We keep the pace steady here, because even brave errands breathe better when no one rushes the next breath. Athena spoke of measures and methods, and she reminded Perseus that skill often meant setting pride aside and letting tools carry the hard part of danger. Perseus accepted that without argument, and Athena nodded once, which was how she showed approval when words would only cloud a simple truth. Hermes explained the Graeae's habit of passing their single eye from hand to hand, and he traced the motion with 2 fingers in the air for Perseus to watch. Perseus watched and rehearsed in his mind, and he pictured his own hand moving with theirs, not to harm them, but to guide the trade a step aside. The nymphs came into their talk as quiet keepers, guardians of items saved for rare need, and Hermes glanced toward a far valley where they would walk. Perseus asked no favors beyond what the task needed, and Athena liked that narrow request, because it kept a man from borrowing trouble he could not repay. The shield she carried lay by her side, and its clean gleam showed how polished discipline could turn a simple surface into a safe kind of sight. Perseus looked at that gleam and understood that he would work by reflection and not by direct staring, which suited a man who preferred solid steps. The sisters' knowledge and the nymphs' keeping would join with that shield, and Hermes's practice would put speed where Perseus needed only enough. It may not have seemed like much then, but those careful pieces made a path that a single swing of courage could not have opened. First, Hermes brought Perseus near the grey eye, as the sisters reached to pass their eye, and Perseus stepped in with a gentleness that surprised even himself. He took the eye with a motion that followed their habit instead of breaking it, and he spoke their names so they knew he was not there to shame them. The sisters asked for its return, and Perseus promised to place it back in fair order once they told him the way to the nymphs who kept the needed things. Hermes watched the exchange with his easy calm, and Athena stood like a wall behind Perseus, turning a risky moment into a proper bargain by her steady presence. The Graeae told them of a valley past low hills and a spring where the keepers met, and Perseus returned the eye to their hand in the same smooth turn. Then the three of them walked to the nymphs, and the keepers greeted Athena with a look that said this was the day their waiting had been for. The nymphs brought out the winged sandals, the cap of invisibility, and the sack stitched to hold a dangerous thing without leaking the harm it carried. Athena lifted her shield and handed it to Perseus, and she showed him how the surface would catch what lay ahead without bringing it fully into his sight. Perseus tried the sandals and felt his balance find a new place, and he set the cap on his head and felt the cool weight settle just right. Hermes walked with him a few steps, showing a short leap and a slow landing, and Perseus practiced until his movements looked plain enough to be trusted. After the gifts were given, Perseus learned the rules that came with them, and he listened until each point sat in his mind without wobbling. Athena told him to use the shield as a mirror and never as armor for charging, and Perseus repeated the steps back to her in his plain voice. Hermes showed him how the cap would let men's eyes slide past him, though his own judgment still had to steer his hands as if he were seen. Perseus opened the sack and practiced the fold that would close over a head without scraping, and he closed it again until the motion became one simple habit. The sandals carried him in short hops at first, and the soft whisper of their straps against his ankles reminded him to keep his steps small and careful. Athena watched those hops and nodded at the patient pace, and Hermes smiled when Perseus chose practice over swagger, because that choice often saved a man. Perseus worked until reflection felt like a sort of sight of its own, and until not being seen felt like standing just outside another man's concern. A small recap sat in his thoughts. He had left a troubled hall with only a promise, and he now stood equipped by keepers who trusted him to use care. That new steadiness gave Perseus something better than nerves, and he understood that the head he sought would ask for steady hands more than fast feet. Soon enough he would prove these lessons in the place where the Gorgons slept, but for now he kept his breathing even and his motions plain. When they sat for a moment before parting, Athena rested the shield against a stone, and Perseus thought about how borrowed light could keep a man alive. He looked at Hermes and saw how easy skill could become a ladder for someone who respected it, which he did, and that seemed to please the guide. The faint scent of olive oil rose from the polished shield, and it reminded Perseus that care was a quiet craft long before it became a loud deed. Athena told him that tools meant trust, because giving them said the gods believed he would do the work without making a mess of other lives. Perseus took that trust seriously, and he thanked the nymphs again, and he named the Graeae with the respect due to old watchers who had kept their post. Hermes warned him that speed had its place, but that standing still at the right time could be quicker than any flight, and Perseus took that line to heart. The nymphs wished him steady weather, and Athena finished by touching the edge of the shield with one finger, just enough to settle its place in his hands. Perseus rose and tightened the straps, and he felt ready in the plain way a man felt ready when his steps were measured, and his mind was clear. He had not fought anyone, and he had not even raised his voice, yet the path to Medusa opened, because he had learned how to borrow well. That lesson kept close as he turned toward the far coast, and it would sit with him later when he remembered how this whole business first began. Chapter 5. Blade Through a Mirror. He reached the shore where the land ended in broken rock, and he stood a while to let his breathing settle. Perseus had travelled far on the winged sandals, and his legs felt hollow, but his mind stayed clear. He had the mirrored shield on his arm and the cap at his belt, and he checked them again. Athena's advice sat close in his thoughts, and Hermes's easy tone came back whenever he touched the sickle. Ahead lay the place where Medusa slept, and he kept that name quiet inside himself so it would not shake him. He thought of Dano on Seriphos, and he thought of Dictys, and he remembered the feast where the promise had been made. The island felt apart from the world, and Perseus let that strangeness slow him down instead of pushing him into haste. He tested a careful step, then another, and he kept his eyes down, knowing the shield would be his only window. Perseus did not speak, and he shaped his breath into steady counts the way fishermen marked the haul of a net. The only sound he marked was the slow wash of waves against stone, a measure that kept his nerves from jumping. In that late hour before dawn, the edge of the world felt near, and the rocks gathered into a low crescent of caves. The lair tucked itself behind a jut of cliff, and a narrow ledge offered a way in that kept his steps close to the wall. Perseus moved along that line with his back to the stone, and he kept his head turned so the shield could do the looking for him. In the mirrored surface, the cave mouth appeared reversed, and he trusted that angle. Inside, there were 3 shapes on the ground, and 2 of them shifted in sleep, while the third lay very still and very alone. The sisters, Stheno and Euryale, had coils of hair that never rested, and their chests rose and fell as they dreamed. Medusa lay separate from them, and Perseus took in her shape in the shield with the care he would give to a knot on a line. He had been told that only this one among the 3 could die, and the other 2 would tear the air to find him when it happened. The ground at the cave mouth sloped enough to catch a heel, so he measured where he would stand before he took another step. A pale bar of moonlight lay across the floor, and he set that line as his guide, knowing he could not afford a stumble. The tools he carried were simple, and Perseus treated them like borrowed bread, not trophies, because each came with a purpose and a limit. The mirror-bright shield from Athena gave him a second sight, and he resolved to use it as if it were a sober companion. The winged sandals from Hermes lifted his heels when he needed height, but he kept them quiet now, saving their beat for the escape. The cap of invisibility rested at his belt, and Perseus knew it would hide him when the sleeping shapes woke and began to seek. The curved blade, sharp and light, waited in his hand, and he remembered the way Hermes had placed it there with a nod. The sack hung loose at his side, and he fingered the mouth of it as if testing a net before the first haul. Quiet steps mattered more than bold thoughts, and we can mark that as part of his way. Medusa lay a few steps away by the count in the shield, and her sleeping face held a danger that did not blink. Stheno and Euryale, the immortal sisters, lay where they were, and Perseus fixed their places in his mind to avoid a blind turn. He pictured how the cut would go, then how the sack would close, then how his heels would rise and carry him out into open air. A thin gleam rested along the shield's rim, and that single line of light helped him keep the world straight in the reversed view. Perseus turned his face aside and raised the shield, then he took one long breath and set his feet where the ledge allowed. He crept toward the still figure that the mirror revealed, and he kept his shoulder leading, the way a rower keeps a stroke straight. Athena had warned him to use distance as a friend, so he lengthened his arm and measured the arc the blade would need. When he was sure, Perseus lifted the curved edge and lined it with the throat shown in the shield, and he steadied his hand. He brought the blade down in a plain, practiced motion, and he did not let himself hurry, and he did not let himself pause. The work went cleanly, and the head came free into his waiting grip, and the sack rose to meet it as if by habit. Perseus slid the prize into the sack and knotted the mouth with care, and only then did he feel the tremor in his knees. Behind him the other shapes stirred, and Stheno's hand swept the ground where he had been, and Euryale drew breath for a cry. Perseus dropped the cap over his hair, and the world let go of him, so he stepped sideways and lifted into open darkness. A faint scrape of bronze brushed the stone as he lifted away, and that small sound fell under the sisters' rising noise like a leaf. It may not have seemed like much then, but that calm hand saved him more surely than speed. From the wound on the neck, the story said life would spring, and Perseus saw it happen as a foal and a boy took shape on the ground. Pegasus shook itself into being, and Chrysaor stood beside the new horse, and both turned their faces toward the dark before they left. Perseus did not call to them, and he did not follow, because his plan asked him to keep moving rather than gather marvels. He rose higher on the sandals, and he kept the sack tight at his side, and he checked the knot as a fisherman checks a hold. Below, Stheno and Euryale raged without aim, and their hands beat the air, and their feet broke rock where they guessed he had stood. He felt the cap's cover doing its quiet work, and Perseus kept his path slanting away, and he trusted the emptiness to hide him. He had come for Medusa's head, and he had it, and that simple fact mattered more than anything that tried to pull his eyes aside. The sandals carried him past the headland and away from the caves, and Perseus fixed a line toward the east and held to it. Behind him the immortals still raged, but their anger could not find him. and he did not give them shape by turning back. A sudden thrum of new wings passed once through the dark, and that single beat faded quickly as if the night had swallowed it whole. Alone again with the sack on his shoulder, Perseus understood that the hardest part had been patience, not strength, and he held to that lesson. He had not met Medusa's eyes, and he had not dared one glance for pride, and those small refusals had kept him whole. Athena's shield had been his true guide, and Hermes's sandals had turned danger into distance, and Perseus kept their help in his thoughts. He did not say a word to the night, and he did not count his work, because the promise marked out the road he still had to walk. Medusa had fallen, and he carried her power in a bag, and he would learn before long what that power could do and undo. He thought of Danae again, and of Dictys, and these names steadied him in a way no charm ever could, which mattered on an open route. He also remembered Polydectes, and the tight room of the feast, and he understood that turning back with empty hands would end that trouble poorly. So Perseus paced himself, and he held to the path the tools allowed, and he planned his stops as if he were still mending nets. It may not have seemed like much then, but the quiet choices in that dark would shape the next turn his journey took, gently enough. All around him the air moved in a low hush that steadied his mind, and he let the night carry him forward without strain. Chapter 6. A Rescue on the Rock. He skimmed along the broken coast, winged sandals beating a steady rhythm, and the salt wind pressed cool against his cheeks as he carried the heavy sack. Perseus had turned his face homeward after the Gorgons, but the shoreline pulled him lower when he noticed a single form fixed to a rock. He narrowed his path and let the sandals slow, and he saw a young woman chained by the arms, quiet and upright despite the strain. Perseus kept the cap at his belt, and the mirror-bright shield close, while the hooked blade rested where his hand could find it without fumbling. He did not show the head, not yet, because the sack already felt like a coiled warning he meant to obey. Andromeda kept her own steadiness as he drifted nearer, and she watched him with a look that measured danger rather than fear. Perseus spoke simply to ask her name and fate, and she answered with a name that would not leave him again. Andromeda told how she had been set there for the sea's payment, and her words were plain without complaint against anyone nearby. Perseus looked beyond the reef and understood that danger gathered there, and he accepted that his journey would turn here whether he liked it or not. He sat down with care on the higher rock, and he promised that he would not leave her to the water while he still could stand. This was the coast of King Cepheus, whose people had watched the water for months after an old boast drew the sea's anger. Cassiopeia had praised her beauty above the Nereids, and that word reached Poseidon, and the price set upon the land was fear made daily. Priests and elders measured omens beside the shore, and a low thud of waves on the stones kept their company in the long days. The answer they decided upon pointed to Andromeda, the daughter, whose quiet grace now met a harsher duty than any household task. Cepheus had agreed because the council insisted, and because the monster had carried off men and flocks until the harbours fell empty. Cassiopeia stood nearby in formal garments loosened by worry, and she kept count of the tide marks because they were the only measure that seemed firm. Perseus took in the plain facts as they were told, and he listened without judgment while the court officers repeated the words they had used. Andromeda listened too, and she did not add to it, because everyone present already knew what had been said in halls and shrines. Perseus measured the chain's iron rings and the height of the rock, and he noted rifts where footing could hold a man in motion. It may not have seemed like much then, but these small reckonings settled his mind before the larger choice pressed upon him. Andromeda was young and slight, with a calm that looked practiced, and she held her shoulders in a way that kept the strain away from panic. Perseus recognized that composure, because Danae had taught a steadiness like it, and he answered it by keeping his own voice and movements even. The chain bit in at the links, and the chill of the iron on her wrists travelled into her arms while she waited without complaint. Cepheus stood tall but thinner than a king wished to be in times like these, and he tried to speak as a ruler rather than a father. Cassiopeia kept her hands close to each other, and she seemed to hold them still the way a person holds a line from slipping at the moor. Perseus arranged the few tools that mattered here, and he showed the mirror-bright shield, the empty sack open at the rim, and the cap laid aside. He kept the sandals ready, and he explained that he would need the family's word, clear and plain if he was to set the daughter free. Cepheus gave it, and he promised Andromeda to Perseus if she lived, while Cassiopeia nodded because the words had already been spoken to the people. It had been said earlier that Phineus held a claim by kinship, and that point sat between them like a stone that no one moved for the moment. Andromeda listened to those promises and kept her gaze on Perseus, and he met it steadily, because that was the only way to honour her strength. First, Perseus rose above the rock and let the chain remain until the danger could be turned aside, because he meant to keep her safe there. Then he flew farther out and studied the water's courses. marking where the creature would lift toward the nearest life left bound and easy. He laid the sack on a ledge and loosened the tie, arranging the head within so the face would turn outward when the time came. Perseus waited with the shield between himself and the sack, and he watched the dim shape draw close along the line he had noted earlier. When the sea beast lunged up, he moved with the sandal's light push, and a wet slap of its tail struck the reef as it reared. He lifted the sack, he turned the awful face toward the open moor, and he kept his own eyes on the shield's steady reflection. The monster stiffened as if struck by winter itself, and the arch of its throat held half-curved, and the scales hardened into a single stone shape. Perseus closed the sack at once and turned away, and he circled so he would not be caught between rock and frozen bulk if it shifted. He landed by Andromeda again, and spoke only when he had covered the sack twice, because he had learnt to give the head respect in every small action. Then he drew the blade and broke the shackles at her wrists and ankles, measuring each cut so the metal opened without grazing skin or leaving burrs. Andromeda stepped free and steadied herself, and Perseus offered his arm not as a rescuer who claimed, but as a man who understood sudden weakness. Cepheus and Cassiopeia came close with gratitude that tried to be formal, and they spoke the pledge again so that everyone nearby heard and accepted the change. Perseus guided Andromeda across the rock toward level ground, and the sunlight warmed her shoulders as if the day itself wished to return to ordinary time. He set the sack beside his shield and tied the strap twice more, because he knew that what saved could also harm if he grew careless. Andromeda stood by her parents while they named witnesses, and she answered firmly that she would go with Perseus when the rites were complete. He had left the Gorgon's shore with a head that no one could meet, and he had used it now to end a different terror with clean finality. The people brought out simple wreaths and water, and they tried to shape a little ceremony around relief, though the king reminded them that customs needed preparation. Perseus accepted a seat in the court enclosure and asked for plain food, and he kept checking the strap because habit sometimes kept a man safe. It was said again that Phineas had been named before in another promise, and that old word would not vanish simply because a new danger had been solved. There would be more to settle in a hall with lamps and guests, but for now Perseus chose quiet thoughts and made room for the day to end. As the sun leaned west, Perseus noticed how the course of his journey had moved from task to meeting and from fear to steadier company. He had set out to protect his mother's days, and he had meant only to bring a single proof back to Seriphos and be done. Instead, Andromeda stood beside him and looked outward with him, and the two of them shared silence that felt like a small agreement neither needed to name. Perseus understood that the head in the sack would follow him for a while longer, and he had to keep using it with care rather than pride. He thought of Athena's strict guidance and Hermes's patient advice, and he kept those voices nearer than the noise that often follows sudden praise. Andromeda thought of her mother's words and her father's duties, and she let the weight on them ease, trusting that better balance could be made again. Perseus looked at the stony ark in the water, and considered how a terrible thing had been turned into a boundary that kept other harms away. It may be useful to say that such turns rarely announced themselves. They arrived in quiet steps, and we recognized them afterward by their steadiness. The evening breeze cooled the shore, and the court officers collected their papers, and the family called for a simple shelter near the palace walls. Perseus walked there with Andromeda at his side, and he felt the road grow clearer beneath his feet, because the return had become something kinder than he expected. Chapter 7. The feast stilled into quiet. They had set a long table in the king's hall, and Andromeda sat beside Perseus while the household moved with careful, grateful hands. King Cepheus stayed near them, and Queen Cassiopeia watched her daughter, and the two elders tried to let the feast feel ordinary. Perseus kept his travel sack close to his feet, and he folded the cap and sandals away, and he steadied his breathing. Andromeda leaned toward Perseus, and he spoke softly to her, and they thanked each person who offered bread, fruit, or a simple blessing. The company felt the relief of danger past, and yet each person kept glancing at the doorway as if expecting one last gust. Cepheus raised a cup toward Perseus, and Perseus lifted his hand in answer, and Andromeda smiled in a way that steadied the room. Cassiopeia counted attendance and checked torches, and she seemed to choose peace for the night, and she set her voice in simple greetings. Perseus rested his hand over the curved shield on the table, and he let the metal be only a plate for olives for now. He had learned to set dangerous things among gentle ones, and he did that again here, making tools appear like household goods. In that quiet, the doors opened, and the trouble entered with Phineas walking first, and the hall tightened as people rose by habit. The hall stood close to the shore, and its open doors looked toward the dark water where the monster had sunk beyond sight. Stone columns held up a roof of cedar, and wide mats made pathways, and servants eased around guests with practiced habits learned over years. Cepheus had hung ship prows along one wall to honor sea help, and he had kept the place for offerings tidy and well marked. Cassiopeia stayed near the dais, and she kept her eyes moving, and she asked names of distant cousins so no person felt left aside. Andromeda sat with hands folded, and she looked to her mother sometimes, and she turned back to Perseus with calm that had been hard won. Perseus watched the doorway, and he watched the side arches too, and he kept himself between trouble and Andromeda, in a way he barely showed. The men who had rowed out with them earlier came inside, and they found corners against pillars, and they kept hands free of food or plates. Phineus stood at the far end with his companions, and he counted faces, and he kept his eyes away from Perseus at first. The smell of salt drifted through the open doors, and it mixed with the cooked grain that had been set out for everyone. It stayed an ordinary night as best it could, and the household tried to keep it that way, and still the air shifted. Phineus was an uncle to Andromeda, and he had been promised her once, and he had never released the promise in his own mind. He brought brothers, cousins, and hired men, and they stood with shields held sideways, and they tried to look like guests until the moment changed. Cepheus wore a thin crown and kept measuring distances between tables, and he seemed to weigh kindness against safety with each breath. Cassiopeia stood straighter than the rest, and she treated the day as a household matter, and her pride stayed firm but not reckless. Andromeda had little voice in such things, and she held her steadiness by holding Perseus' gaze, and she let authority sit where it belonged. Perseus kept his sword belted and his shield idle, and he kept the sack ready under the table, and he knew which help mattered. Hermes had warned him about needless fights, and Athena had shown him how to turn away ruin, and he carried those lessons without speech. Phineus believed every promise could be enforced by men, and Perseus believed some promises changed when lives were saved, and those two beliefs faced each other. The companions of Phineus placed their hands on spear shafts, and they watched the king's guards, and they underestimated quiet tools kept under a table. It may not have seemed like much then, but the way Perseus kept still and counted allies mattered when the hall began to tilt. Phineus moved first, and he told men to take the bride, and he pointed past Cepheus as if the king were a curtain to be pulled. Cepheus tried to speak law, and Cassiopeia raised her hand, and Andromeda reached for Perseus without looking away from the men who were coming. Perseus rose and stepped before Andromeda, and he called to Cepheus to turn his face, and he told Cassiopeia to close her eyes. He asked loyal guards to stoop behind shields, and he touched the sack with care, and he named friends in the hall to look to the floor. Then he brought out Medusa's head, and he held it as if holding a bowl of embers, and he kept the face turned just so. The scrape of benches across stone sounded as men changed their minds too slowly, and those nearest Phineus froze while still lifting their arms to strike. Phineus stared with anger that turned to fear, and his feet stuck before he had chosen whether to argue or beg, and he hardened there. Perseus swept the gaze along the line of attackers, and he spared those who had not lifted a hand, and he let pillars hide others. Cepheus kept his face down, and Cassiopeia followed the warning, and Andromeda pressed her forehead to Perseus' shoulder until the movement stopped. When it grew still, Perseus turned the head back into the sack, and he bound the mouth tight, and he asked friends to raise their eyes again. He had not shouted more than he needed, and he had not chased anyone outside the hall, and he kept the power close. The hall stood around new shapes, and the company measured them with quiet eyes, and the threat that had shouted a moment before no longer moved. Cepheus looked to Cassiopeia, and the two of them nodded, and their servants began to set the table straight again without speeches or complaint. Andromeda held Perseus' wrist, and Perseus spoke her name, and each said little because beyond relief there was also the strange weight of survival. Cassiopeia asked that the feast continue in a steadier way, and she set guards at the doors, and she told musicians to hold their hands. He had saved Andromeda from the sea beast, and now he steadied her place beside him while closing this last danger inside a quiet hall. Cepheus spoke the marriage aloud with plain words, and Perseus answered clearly, and Andromeda answered as well, and the people accepted what Mercy had arranged. A light smell of oil rose from the lamps, and it met the cooler air from the sea, and it kept the room in an easy balance. Perseus thanked Cepheus and Cassiopeia, and he thanked the guards he had guided, and he thanked the men who had kept their heads turned. He remembered that his tools belonged to gods, and he remembered that his life had been loaned time and again, and he kept a modest voice. There would be other halls and older reckonings ahead, and he sensed the road bending back toward the island that had sent him out. Later, when the tables were cleared, Perseus walked the hall with Cepheus, and the king named the men turned to stone with the same care as living guests. Andromeda joined them, and she noted which ones had held back, and she asked that their families be spared needless shame and needless fear. Cassiopeia listened to Perseus, and she heard how he had angled the head, and she nodded because measured force left fewer regrets. Cassiopeia's promised to move the statues to the outer court, and he planned to place them as a warning, and also as a kept memory. Cassio agreed quietly, and he said Medusa's power did not belong in sport, and he said he would not lift it again except for necessity. The hush of the tide outside stayed steady, and it gave the room something dependable while plans for morning were settled without any bragging. Andromeda rested her hand on Perseus' arm, and Perseus rested his on hers, and the two of them held a calm neither one had known alone. They had come through sea danger and hall dispute, and they had done it with names spoken clearly and eyes averted when needed. Perseus folded the cap and sandals again, and he set the sack where he could see it, and he thanked Athena in his thoughts. He did not treat the night as triumph, and he treated it as a step, and he let quiet join the start of a shared life. Chapter 8. A quiet reckoning on Seriphos. He stepped from the boat onto the familiar strand of Seriphos, and Perseus felt the island receive him as if no time had passed. Andromeda came beside him, steadying the sack at his shoulder while he looked toward the ridge where the king kept his hall. Danae and Dictys were here somewhere, and Perseus kept their names close in his thoughts as he started up the worn path. Polydectes had not expected him to return with anything, and the old pressure that had pushed him out still stood waiting ahead. He had the tools of the gods still upon him, yet Perseus kept his steps even, careful not to stir more notice than needed. The promise made in the hall long ago had carried him far, and that promise pointed him now back into another hall. It felt like a circle closing, and he did not rush it, because Andromeda matched his pace, and because the burden asked for care. We keep the pace steady here, because hurried steps cause slips, and Perseus had learned that truth on rocky paths and in marble halls. Perseus thought of the fisherman who had lifted him from a chest, and he hoped to lift that fisherman from a different box. Dictys had hidden Danae when he could, and Danae had hidden herself when she must, and both had waited for a better day. The smell of salt lay on the air as he climbed, and the island felt plain and small, but it held everything that mattered. In the late afternoon hours, the path curled past net sheds and low houses, and the old cove opened into a gentle lane toward the ridge. Perseus noted how the nets had been patched again and again, and he recognized the hand that had taught him those careful knots. Andromeda watched the town with a quiet gaze, and Andromeda kept near while he weighed where to find his mother first. Danae would have stayed near a shrine if she was threatened, and she often placed herself where women gathered, because that kept eyes near her. Dictys would have returned to his boats when he could, and Dictys would have offered coin and food where the door was trusted. Polydectes had filled the main hall with guests for show in the past, and Polydectes had likely returned to the same habit by now. Perseus chose the hall before the shrine, because the hall held the hand that squeezed everything else, and the hall set the tone for the island. He kept the cap and sandals quiet at his sides, and he kept the shield covered, and he tapped the folded sack for reassurance. People stepped aside when they saw him, and people looked again when they saw Andromeda, proud and calm, carrying herself like someone who had survived. The wind carried a low hiss through the dry grass along the path, and the sound walked with them as they came to the gate. At the gate stood two of Polydectes' men, and their faces showed strain, though their spears hung idle, as if custom had replaced purpose. Perseus greeted them by name, and Perseus asked them to wait outside the doorway, because he wanted no harm for men who owed him nothing. Andromeda stayed near the threshold, and Andromeda drew her cloak so it could cover her eyes if he gave the word, steady as a practiced friend. Polydectes sat within on a high chair, and Polydectes wore the neat smile he saved for unexpected guests, with courtiers near him and cups ready. Danae was not beside him, and Danae was not in the corner where women sometimes watched the games of men, which told Percy enough. Dictys was not in sight either, and Dictys would not have been invited to such a seat unless the king wanted laughter at a fisherman. The sack that held Medusa's head lay against his shoulder, and the strap felt cool through the cloth, a reminder to move with care inside this room. He had worn the cap of invisibility, and the winged sandals across many miles, and he had used the mirror shield where sight would fail him. Here, inside his first home after the chest, Perseus understood that words might serve first, and he gave himself a small pause before he spoke. Polydectes waited with that smile, and Polydectes raised one brow as if humouring a fisherman's boy returning with a rehearsed story to share. First he asked where his mother was, and Perseus put Danae's name plainly into the air so no one could pretend to miss the point. Polydectes answered that she was safe, and Polydectes added that safety had a price she could not possibly meet without help from a dutiful son. Then Perseus said he had brought proof that promises could be kept, and he asked the king and his court to stand and face him. Andromeda turned her body toward the door at his sign, and Andromeda lowered her gaze as she had learned to do on another hard day. Perseus told the guard at the door to keep his eyes on the lintel, and he spoke softly, because softness carried better than shouting in such rooms. Polydectes laughed and waved his court nearer, and Polydectes told his men to bring the mother, if that would end the afternoon with something amusing. Then Perseus unfolded the sack and kept his face turned, and Perseus lifted what he had carried so far, and he held it high for the king alone. A single cup slipped from someone's hand and rang on the floor, and that small sound marked the last movement any of those faces ever made. The king stiffened where he sat, and Polydectes' mouth held its shape too long. While the row of flatterers by the wall leaned into an endless posture, Perseus covered the head again, and he called for Danae and Dictys by name, and he asked the guard to turn and guide them in. Danae came from a small chamber near the hearth, and Danae stepped into the hall with Dictys beside her, cautious until she recognized what had changed. Dictys lowered his head at the row of stone, and Dictys waited for Perseus to speak before he crossed the space between them with relief. Perseus told them that the danger had ended here, and Perseus told them that the island needed steady hands, because gaps always invite worse troubles. He asked his mother to rest without fear, and he asked Dictys to accept the seat of the island, not as plunder, but as repair. Andromeda smiled at Danae with quiet kinship, and Andromeda held the sack closed while Perseus tied it fast, mindful of how easily harm could follow carelessness. Men and women drifted in at the edges, and they looked on the new stillness. Then they looked at Dictys, who had given them fair measure for years. Perseus named Dictys for the chair, and Perseus asked the people to treat the statues as warnings and as marks of their own past appetite for flattery. Their sandals made a soft scrape on the stone floor as they moved the shapes aside, and that simple work returned the hall to everyday use. He had used Medusa's head at the rock to save Andromeda, and he had used it here to free his mother, and that was enough for him. Soon he would give the head to Athena and travel on toward other business, and he wanted this place set in order before he laid it down. That evening, Perseus sat with Danae and Dictys by the door of the hall, and he let the passing of the day slow his thoughts. Andromeda leaned on the step beside him, and Andromeda watched the quiet street where children counted pebbles, and an old woman measured herbs for tomorrow. Dictys spoke of the nets and the harbour Jews, and Dictys wondered how to speak to those who had feared Polydectes but praised him in public. Danae answered that honest measures and open doors did their own work, and Danae reminded them all that people rest easier when the rules were simple. Perseus kept the sack close by his side, and Perseus thought about the burden he would release when he reached the one who had lent it. He spoke of the cap and the sandals, and he planned to return those as well, because borrowed power belonged where it could not be misused. Andromeda said they could leave after a few dawns, and Andromeda trusted Dictys to gather helpers and to set fair watch along the port. Perseus agreed, and Perseus told Dictys that a fisherman's patience might serve better than a soldier's hand when he faced the small storms of rule. The evening breeze touched the harbour with a cooler edge, and that simple change told them the island would sleep under ordinary skies again. Satisfied that Dana would not be pressed again, Perseus closed his eyes for a time, holding quiet company with those he loved and with the work ahead. Chapter 9. A discus across a quiet field. He climbed the temple steps with the leather sack resting light in his hand, feeling at last that a burden had reached its proper door. Perseus set the bundle down before the image of Athena and spoke in the plain way he had learned, thanking the goddess for straight guidance. Athena, who had watched him from the first boast to the rescue and the reckoning, accepted Medusa's head and promised to guard others with its hard power. The goddess lifted the terrible thing with practiced care, while Perseus kept his eyes a little aside, remembering how easily missteps grew from careless looks. With a nod, Athena drew the head toward her aegis, and the sign of her house gained a weight that did not need more words. Hermes waited nearby as well, and Hermes smiled to see the winged sandals and the cap returned without fuss, as if tools were neighbours. Perseus thanked Hermes by name, then thanked Athena again, and the names helped him stand steady, because names set people in place during changing hours. Behind him, Andromeda stood quietly with Danae, and the two women listened to the murmur that seemed to fill any holy room where decisions settled. It may not have seemed like much then, but the return itself mattered, because giving up a weapon taught Perseus how to go back to living. The temple's stone felt cool under his palm as he turned to leave, and the coolness steadied the next steps he had to choose. The days that followed moved at a walking pace, with Perseus, Andromeda, and Danae taking the road that bent toward Argos and the houses of their past. He did not rush, because haste had never served him well, and Andromeda kept the pace in a way that kept travel gentle for Danae. Villages they passed had heard parts of the tale, and Perseus heard his name from doorways, then returned to the quiet of the road whenever greetings faded. Dictys had chosen to remain on Seriphos to tend the new order, so Perseus leaned more on Andromeda's steady sense and on Danae's careful memory. They spoke sometimes about Perseus, and sometimes they let silence do the work, because old hurts liked simple air rather than tangled answers. Perseus sent a message ahead to Argos, telling Acrisius by name that he came in peace and meant no harm to an aging father. Danae read the lines before the messenger left, and Danae touched his arm to show that the words were plain and good enough for meeting again. The messenger went on, while Perseus turned a little aside toward the north when rumors reached them that Acrisius had moved to avoid any sharp meeting. It may have seemed like a detour, but Perseus preferred a clear path, and he chose to honor an old fear by not pushing matters. Dust puffed at each step on the road as the three travelers walked, and the small clouds rose and fell without concern for anyone's thoughts. Acrisius, the old king who had feared a child's shadow long ago, lived quietly under another city's roof and kept his face from public feasts. He had grown thinner and greyer, and Acrisius listened more than he spoke, the way men do when they have counted too many seasons. News of Perseus reached him the way news travels everywhere, half carried by strangers and half carried by worry. So Acrisius moved again to stay unseen. The ruler of Larissa prepared public games for a funeral rite, and athletes gathered from wide towns to throw, to run, and to wrestle on clean ground. Perseus heard of the games on the way and turned there for hospitality, thinking a few days of rest would keep spirits even for Danae and Andromeda. Andromeda watched the bustle with an open look, and Danae rested in the shade while Perseus greeted the hosts and offered thanks for their open field. Acrisius drifted along the edges of that same place, curious in the quiet manner of an old man, choosing spots that kept him out of center sight. Acrisius gave his name to the officials and stood with the other throwers, because games were a way for strangers to show they meant belonging rather than threat. The herald of the games called the events in cadence, and the ring of his voice carried across the field and kept the order. It may not have seemed like more than a town's custom then, but the gathering of many names in one place had its own pull. First the runners took their turn, and Perseus watched them fly across the marked earth, then clapped the way any guest ought to clap among new friends. Then came the disc, the broad stone circle that fit the hand, and Perseus stepped forward when his time came, steady in the small things of stance. He tested the balance and matched his breathing to the weight, while Andromeda watched from the side and Danae kept her hands folded near her lap. Perseus turned once, not fast, then drew the circle back and threw, sending the heavy arc outward the way any practiced thrower aims toward a harmless patch. The line of the throw bent at the wrong moment, not by much, but enough to carry it away from the markers. He saw the disc ride higher than intended, and felt the slow dread that came when simple tools did not obey the simple intentions built into them. The crowd shifted as one, because crowds move that way, and some stepped back while others froze, and a single shape lingered along the outer ring. Acrisius stood at that edge where onlookers cluster, and he turned to see who threw, and he lifted a hand in the reflex of recognition. The discus struck with a finality no one could recall, and whirled narrowed to the space between a thrower and a man he had not come to harm. A thin whistle from the spinning stone had ridden the air as it flew, and the whistle faded as quickly as any small sound in a large place. People gathered into a still ring, and the officials moved quickly, but the stillness of the center told everyone that some balances do not lean back upright. Perseus reached Acrisius and went to his knees, and Acrisius looked up at him with the surprise any father would wear when a child's path arrived without invitation. Danae came close and spoke to Acrisius by name, and Andromeda kept space for them while she hushed the nearby line of women who had come to watch. Acrisius breathed in small sips, then let go, and Perseus understood that a life built around one fear had curved itself back to that same feared point. He did what a son ought to do, even when estranged, making sure the rites were sure, the words were spoken, and the body was given due respect. The ruler of Larissa stood with them, and called the games for the day, not in anger, but in plain order, that grief requires among strangers. Perseus did not try to excuse what had happened, and he did not try to blame the air or the circle, because truth helped others keep their footing. He had left Seriphos, given the head to Athena, and come homeward in peace, and still the path had led to this old ending that others had feared. It may not have seemed like direction then, but in time Perseus would let this turn him toward building instead of breaking, which would matter for households ahead. A hush lay over the field after the body was carried away, and the hush held like a simple cloth laid over a table that families share. When evening came, Perseus sat with Andromeda and Danae in a small room near the grounds, and the three of them spoke in low, straight words. Andromeda set her hand in his, and Andromeda did not try to lighten what could not be lightened, but she kept him from turning the day into self-punishment. Danae looked at her son and at the window, and Danae said that fear had ruled too many rooms already, and that enough had finally been paid. Perseus listened and agreed, because listening had grown into a habit with him, the kind that keeps a house steady through years rather than weeks. He thought of Athena and the guarded head, and he thought of Hermes and the tools returned, and he let those names rest like cornerstones under his mind. Acrisius had died by a discus thrown by the grandson he tried to prevent, and the prophecy had closed in a manner that asked for acceptance, not argument. Perseus decided he would not claim a throne out of this, and Perseus would look instead to places where new walls might rise without stepping on graves. In the days to come he would choose land with care, and he would carry Andromeda beside him, and he would keep Danae close whenever seasons allowed. This was a quiet promise, and it was not made for an audience, but it shaped the path the three of them would walk when they left Larissa. The lamplight in the room threw a mild circle around their faces, and that small circle was enough for rest before the next plain day. Chapter 10. Quiet Foundations. He set the first stone at daybreak beside Andromeda, and the hill held steady under Perseus' hands while the builders waited in a quiet ring. Perseus checked the shape again, then nodded to the foreman, and Andromeda followed his eye toward the line where walls would mark the new life. They used a simple cord for measure, because simple tools stayed true, and Perseus liked things that answered plainly when steady work tested them. Andromeda spoke to the women who had come from nearby farms, and she asked after families, and she learnt names that would belong to these streets. He called 2 boys to bring the wedge, then set his shoulder to the block because he had always preferred effort that made sense to the day. Perseus kept his gaze on the ground rather than the far horizon, since close work had taught him that cities grew from near tasks done well. Andromeda stayed near his left, and she matched his pace, and Perseus found that her nearness settled the last unsettled corners in his chest. They spoke of gates, cisterns, markets, and a place for prayers, and Perseus listened more than he answered, letting the place tell them what it needed. He paused then, and he pressed his palm to the limestone, and the morning warmth gathered in his skin and travelled upward like a polite greeting. Perseus smiled at Andromeda, and she nodded back, and that small agreement began the years that people later called the settled part of his story. In the years after the games and the level field, work stretched across the Argive plain from Tyrins to the new hill that would bear heavy walls. Perseus avoided the throne at Argos, and he visited Megapenthus, and the 2 men agreed to an exchange that set each in a place with fewer shadows. He honoured Danae in each decision, and Perseus kept her in his plans, because long paths felt safer when his mother's comfort stayed in mind. Andromeda walked the ground with him, and she traced the limits of fields, and Perseus marked out roads that would carry wagons rather than armies. Seasons turned in a calm way, and the builders learned one another's habits, and the foreman began to think of himself as a neighbour instead of a hire. Children followed the surveyors, and Perseus learned to step slowly so small legs could keep close, and Andromeda told stories that kept the path interesting. A spring not far from the ridge gave water enough for homes and baths, and Perseus counted that modest abundance as better luck than any omen. The days carried the ring of hammers across the slope, and that sound promised that loose ground would become streets where feet might linger without fear. Athena's name was spoken at cornerstones and thresholds, and Perseus asked for her steady guard over the works more than he asked for marvels. We keep the pace steady here, and that pace suited him, and it suited Andromeda, and it set the frame for everything that followed calmly. Perseus stood broad in the shoulders from years of rowing and lifting, and he spoke in measured tones that made room for replies before decisions landed. Andromeda carried a calm that steadied crowded rooms, and she preferred to speak last, and Perseus learned that last words sometimes freed earlier ones to breathe. Danae lived with them as seasons allowed, and she kept a corner busy with family talk, and Perseus returned to that familiar comfort whenever days stretched long. Megapenthus visited from time to time, and the 2 men exchanged grain and timber rather than envy, because trade cooled old words that had once been sharp. Athena stayed as a steady presence in the way plans came together, and Perseus sent thanks to her altars whenever the work fitted better than expected. Hermes was named when messengers arrived cleanly, and Andromeda added his name when routes proved shorter than the maps, which felt like friendly help rather than luck. They had children, and Perseus learned patience in new ways, because small questions arrived at all hours and shaped larger choices during the next days. Perseus was quick to ask about distant lands, and Alcaeus kept his mind on tools, and Electryon leaned into training that made his steps sure. Sthendelus compared measures without impatience, and Gorgophone collected names and neighbours, and Hellebulus and Mestor liked maps more than hunting. Perseus held the small hand of a child during evening walks, and that soft weight reminded him to keep the ground level for steps that followed. They were ordinary in the right ways, and they were notable enough to draw visitors, and Perseus kept his door open without letting rooms turn into courts. First Perseus made the exchange with Megapenthus firm, and he took Tyrins for his seat, and he let Argos pass to the other line without bitterness. Then he chose the nearby ridge for a new place, and he measured the circuit himself, and he named overseers, who knew walls began with drains and roads. After that, he sent word to craftsmen in neighboring towns, and he paid fair rates, and he kept granaries stocked so work would not falter during lean stretches. Perseus set aside a broad level space for Athena, and he asked that her shield be shown there on festival days, so children would remember her guard. At times he travelled to a larger temple, and stood while the aegis lifted, and the old Gorgon face kept in bronze held a cold, steady gleam. He had no wish to wield that power again, and Perseus felt relief time he saw it safe in her keeping, with sacred rules holding it in place. Hermes' name received a small shrine near the gates, and the winged sandals he had once borrowed were honoured with a carved likeness that made children grin. Perseus marked boundaries with stones, and he asked elders from nearby villages to witness, and he wrote down what had only been spoken so words would hold. Farmers ploughed without fear, and traders chose these roads, and Perseus sent patrols as far as the passes, not to threaten, but to greet and to guide. Where raids had been common, tales began to tell of a city under a watchful goddess, and raiders turned their plans toward easier harbours and less stubborn fields. Andromeda kept the hearth of the town steady, and she learned the names of those who travelled in, and Perseus relied on her memory when lists grew long. It may not have seemed like much then, but these careful arrangements mattered when the years pressed in with ordinary tests. Years broadened the streets, and shops settled into corners, and Perseus walked them at evening, checking doors and greetings without the weight of a crisis on his shoulders. Andromeda stopped often at the market, and she kept small balances moving among weavers and bakers, which made coin feel like a neighbour rather than a test. He listened to disputes under an open canopy, and Perseus decided with help of elders, and both sides left knowing that reasons not tempers had carried the day. The smell of warm bread near the square softened late meetings, and it reminded Perseus that order began with ordinary comfort before it reached for grand ideas. Children grew into adults, and Perseus found his name spoken gently in their mouths, which told him that he had stepped away from the harsher parts of fame. He sent gifts to Dictys across the sea, and he asked news of Seriphos, and Andromeda smiled at the reports of mild weather and simple fishing. From the chest to the open sea, through borrowed tools, a rescue, and a discus on a clear day, the long bend of his path had steadied. Perseus felt that steadying most in the way work continued without him, and Andromeda felt it in how neighbours taught one another without waiting for commands. Danae watched grandchildren marry, and she settled into a peace that had once seemed far away, and Perseus counted that as a truer triumph than any trophy. Stories about them travelled beyond the hills, and a grandson with strong hands would one day make his own way into old songs beside other names. For now it remained enough that gates stood, fields held, and Athena's guard made the hardest memory into a tool meant for safekeeping rather than fear. In the last measure of his days, Perseus sat on the same ridge where he had chosen the first line, and Andromeda sat at his side. He spoke in an easy way about stones and suns, and he left the sharper stories where they belonged, down among scrolls and winter talk. Perseus thought of Acrisius without anger, and he thought of Polydectes without edge, because time had moved the weight of those names into lessons rather than pains. He remembered Athena's help where his judgment had ended, and he remembered Hermes' guidance where steps had almost faltered, and he felt simple gratitude more than anything else. Andromeda spoke the names of their children and neighbours, and Perseus repeated them, because names deserved to be kept smooth by use rather than worn by worry. At night the stars took their places above the hills, and Perseus watched their cold shine settle the sky into a map he no longer needed to follow. He had carried a head that stopped hearts, and he had seen it lifted again for guarding, and Perseus knew the difference between danger and duty. It may not have seemed like much to others, but the quiet way he handed power on to safer hands stood as his best measure. Perseus leaned against the woman he had saved and married, and the city he had chosen continued around them in the small ways cities continue. When people later named the constellations for them, the signs only confirmed what had already settled, that their lives had become part of the calm overhead. And so, dear knight, our tale of Perseus and the fearsome Medusa comes to an end. May your rest be peaceful, and may your dreams shield you from every shadow. Until our next story, ride onward beneath the stars. Good night.